Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. If you like this episode, I hope you'll subscribe and ask your friends to do the same. Well, my guest today is Micky Tripathi. He's National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He leads the development of the federal government's health IT strategy, and he coordinates its execution. Welcome, Micky.
Thanks, David. Delighted to be here. Great to see you again.
You know, usually the people I interview have a title like CEO and founder, and I don't think I've ever interviewed somebody as powerful as you with a title like coordinator. You know, why is it called the coordinator? Do you know?
I actually don't know. I should go back and wait a minute. I should say I think because a part of the job is about coordinating.
Yeah.
And because I think there was recognition early on that this job was going to be about corralling lots of different folks and less about strict authority, government regulations, like an assistant secretary. Now we are an assistant secretary peer. So I'm kind of a peer to an assistant secretary, but I'm not an assistant secretary.
Right.
I have no idea what that means really. I report directly to the secretary, just like all the other assistant secretaries and just like the head of the CDC and the FDA. So there you go.
No, that all makes sense. Well, I skipped ahead a little bit because I said I was going to ask about your background and upbringing. And I could ask, like, when did you first know you wanted to be a coordinator? But I think we'll save that question for later. So what was your upbringing like? Where'd you grow up? Did you have any childhood influences that have stuck with you?
Yeah, sure. So here I am. You can actually see I'm in the house that I moved to when I was in 10th grade. This is my parents' house in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. And that's where I grew up, right outside of Lowell. And, we both my parents are doctors. So in terms of influence, I think there was a lot of influence, from the beginning of, the medical profession. And as, those listeners who are from, immigrant families, in particular Indian immigrant families, and in particular Indian immigrant families who are physicians, they will know the push to, well, you're going to be a doctor, of course, right? I went all the way through college, realized that maybe medical school wasn't for me. I was more interested in sort of broader policy things. And so ironically ended up back working directly with in the medical community. So I'm really happy to have made that full circle.
Your parents maybe knew more about how to influence the young mind than you thought.
That's right.
You're not the first person that I've interviewed from an Indian immigrant family where the parents were physicians, and it was one that knew he didn't want to be a doctor and ended up eventually in healthcare in some form, like you are. But it was like as long as he was studying something had to do with medical, he could actually go and do all these other things as well. So it was very interesting. So, but why Vassar? You went to college at Vassar. So.
Yeah, I went to college at Vassar. I was really looking for a place that wasn't so driven by college sports and fraternities. It was just not criticizing those institutions, but it was really, sort of not the kind of college experience that I was looking for. And so as I was looking across, sort of the different options I had, that just struck me as being, sort of a really nice balance of having, a lot of diversity and a lot of different things going on. And, certainly sports and, collegiality and different kinds of groups was, certainly a part of it. But wanting a little bit of that, sort of small school feel as well. And for anyone who's never been to Vassar, one of we always used to say when we were at Vassar that if you go to Vassar on your college tour and it's a beautiful day, you're never going to go anywhere else because it's just spectacularly beautiful. The campus itself is beautiful. And I happened to go on a really beautiful day as well. So that was certainly a part of it.
Nice. That definitely helps. And then did you go to the Kennedy School right after college?
No. So I took a year in between college and grad school and went to Washington and interned on Capitol Hill. So I did the first half of my year interning for a congressional caucus called the Arms Control and Foreign Policy Caucus. So I majored in political science and was really interested in foreign policy and international relations and defense policy. And then, back at the time for those of your listeners who are old, like you and me, will
Hey.
remember the nuclear freeze and the no nukes and all of that. I was very involved in that political activity, and so I interned for the first 6 months with this congressional caucus on the House side, and then the second half of the year interned for Senator Paul Tsongas, who was the senator from Massachusetts at the time, and but I knew I wanted to go to grad school, and so took that year to apply and get a little bit of experience under my belt, which was fantastic experience.
I know it was a freeze. I remember a flexible freeze or something too. Wasn't that one of the things that was discussed at the time?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, every negotiating sort of tactic you could take to try to slow it down, even though we couldn't stop it.
Exactly. Well, I grew up in Bethesda, so I was immersed in a lot of that stuff as well.
Right,
and so then you did end up back at I think DoD and related areas after that. So what was that all about?
Yeah, so I went I went to the Kennedy School, spent 2 years there, which was great. Still was focused on foreign policy and defense policy for the most part, but also sort of did a parallel focus on quantitative methods, statistical analysis, economic analysis. And then coming out of that, I was looking at the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. It was called the PMI program back then. Now it's called the PMF program, which is a federal government program to try to recruit people into federal service, and particularly into management levels in federal service. Basically trying to see if they could try to beat McKinsey and BCG and Bain getting graduate students before they get attracted to that, to say, hey, spend a couple of years with the federal government. You get a lot of great experience. And so I got caught up in that. And as I was looking across the opportunities, I started looking at the Pentagon and thought, wouldn't it be really interesting to be, sort of someone who was on the left side of the political spectrum, to be working within the Pentagon itself, a nuclear freeze person working in the Pentagon. So ended up being fortunate enough to get offered a role there. And I started off working in the Air Force Controller's Office, writing regulations for how to do an economic analysis for investments in real assets of Air Force property, everything except for weapon systems.
Yeah.
So if you were going to try to build a bachelor officers' quarters at Aviano Air Base in Italy, what kind of analysis did you have to do to sort of get the approvals for that? So we did all sorts of introduced net present value, discounted cash flow, all of that, where people were like, whoa, wait a minute. And it's like, well, that's basic economic analysis. And then moved over, after I did like 2 or 3 years with the Air Force, moved over to the Secretary of Defense's office and worked in an office. It's actually a really interesting office. It's called PA&E, Program Analysis and Evaluation. Some people may have heard of it. It was referred to colloquially as the whiz kids. It was created under President John Kennedy, who, when he came in, he had many people may remember Bob McNamara, who was the head of, he was the CEO of Ford Motor Corporation, but he was also, sort of an academic leader in decision science. He was a professor at Harvard Business School and did a lot of work in decision science. So he came in as Secretary of Defense, and one of the first things he did was said, we need to apply quantitative analysis to our decisions about, purchases of weapon systems and other things. And he hired a group of economists and created this new office called Program Analysis and Evaluation. And for those who are in healthcare, they may be interested to know that the first head of PA&E was Alan Enthoven,
Nice.
who later went into, the founder of managed care and, and all of that. Alan Enthoven was first a defense analyst. And so he established this office, hired a bunch of economists, and they started doing economic analysis and cost benefit analysis on the weapon systems. So that's where I ended up in that office, looking specifically at Navy and Marine Corps systems.
Got it. So after all this sort of MBA style stuff and competing with, McKinsey and BCG, then you went for a PhD, but in political science. Is that right?
Yeah, it was political science and economics. So
okay.
So it was political science, but then I was at MIT, so I was able to kind of do both of those in parallel. And yeah, I mean, I wasn't really sure exactly, what was going to be the right field. I was very interested in quantitative analysis and economics, but to be frank, I was pretty certain I wouldn't get into a top economics program. And
Okay.
so the advice that I got from a number of people who were great mentors to me, like the head of PA&E at the time, a guy named David Chu, who had, he advised get into the best school you possibly can in whatever way you can, and then you can do whatever you want there. And so
Great.
I, leaned heavily into political science, got into a great program at MIT, and then was able to do economics and political science in a parallel track. So that was great. It was really fun.
So right after that is, I think, when we first ran into one another at Boston Consulting Group. Is that my timeline about right?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, because I had this weird idea when I went to get my PhD that I wanted to teach, and I already had two kids then. My wife
Yeah.
and I had already had, sort of had started our careers in the federal government. We wanted to move back to Boston, so it was a great, sort of transition, forcing function to move back to Boston, and gave us something to do once we landed. But I had this idea that I would go into teaching, and then as I started to get to the end of that, realized that was not a great plan because I was seeing some of my peers or people who were just a year ahead of me who I thought were way smarter than me,
Yeah.
and they were taking entry level teaching jobs at University of South Dakota for $25,000 a year. And I, nothing against University of South Dakota, but I was, had already had two kids. I wanted to stay in the Boston area, and I was like, oh, that's not like a great plan. And this is like 1999, 1998, and you were at BCG at the time, so that was right at the time the dot-com boom was happening. All the consulting firms were realizing that if once they started dipping deeper into the MBA stream, they started realizing, oh, actually quality seems to fall off once you dive
Yeah.
deeper. Maybe we should start to, sort of go across and look at PhD students, MDs, JDs, and of course the hubris of the management consulting companies. We can train them to do anything.
Yeah.
We just need them to come with the horsepower. So anyway,
Yeah.
I got caught up in that there were management consulting firms were on the MIT campus saying, come on, get you pass the first round interview, you get a buy or something. I had never even heard of BCG.
Yeah.
I kind of heard of McKinsey. I had no idea what they did, but I thought, oh, well, may as well try it, and ended up, having the opportunity to take a job there, which was really
Nice.
exciting.
Well, I was there, and I was on sort of toward the end of my role there, and I think we were overlapped a bit, and then you stayed on a little bit. Did they end up training you, and did you learn anything there?
I did. I learned a ton there, actually. I thought it was one of the best and most formative experiences in my career. It just taught me. I felt like a lot about how to sort of tackle difficult problems. And, again, some of that was about, sort of skills and tools. Some of that was about attitude and hubris. But, but, all of it put together. And I think a lot of, sort of management skills, a lot of people skills, a lot of relationship skills, how to work with clients, how to think about, sort of having the customer see themselves in everything that you're doing. And that if you're not doing that, if you're not empathetic in a deep way with your customers, then you're not really able to get anything accomplished. And, I thought it was just a fantastic experience for me.
Then I think it was a client situation, right, when you were in Indiana with the Health Information Exchange there. So this is way back before HITECH, the HITECH Act, and the early federal government's involvement in supporting electronic medical records or health information exchange. But as I recall, you were working or seconded or took the job there in Indiana before, coming back to the Massachusetts eHealth Collaborative.
Yeah, so we there was an engagement that BCG had with an organization out in Indianapolis. I think at the time it was called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. It was kind of a business development CEO level kind of organization where a lot of the big bioscience companies who are based in Indianapolis would put money in every year to try to sort of seed or motivate business development in certain areas. And they had seen some work that BCG had done for the Mass High Tech Council that was looking at markets where government, academia, and industry sort of can generate synergies and can create sort of a real fertile business ground for business and innovation. And they had asked BCG to come out and look at that in Indianapolis. And so there was a team that went out did sort of a screen. David, you know exactly how this works. They did
Yeah.
an opportunity screen. What are the capabilities? What are your competitive advantages? What are San Diego and Boston doing? What does Indianapolis have that's unique? How do you attract capital? All that stuff. Anyway, one of the things that they pointed to was what they called evidence-based medicine, which was looking at the work that the Reagan Street Institute and some of the legendary people there, like Dr. Mark Overhage and Dr. Clem McDonald, were doing there, and they identified that as an opportunity area. And so they delivered the report. The folks in Indianapolis looked at that. They came back and they said, we actually want to fund the creation of a business plan for this one as well as another one. And so I was the project leader who went out and led the team that spent probably a year writing the business plan for what eventually became IHI, the Indiana Health Information Exchange. And then after that, they asked if I would be willing to be the CEO just to launch it. And that's when we had some executive on loan kind of sort of arrangement with BCG so that I could do that from Boston, still as a BCG employee. Most important thing to me was finding my successor, who we knew he was going to be. It was just trying to convince him, and it took about a year to convince him to take it over.
Great. Well, then I remember these conversations when you came back and we were talking about this Massachusetts eHealth Collaborative, which I think was funded because of one of the, I don't know, unique but unusual things in Massachusetts. You had all these non-for-profit health plans. Blue Cross, as I recall, had run up too large of a surplus, and there was an opportunity for them to invest it perhaps rather than having it confiscated, to invest it in a way that was going to be able to advance the overall health of Massachusetts and kind of push us ahead on adoption of electronic medical records and health information exchange before there was anything like that at the federal level. But what was your take on it? Why'd you do it, and why'd you stick with it?
Yeah. So it was really, it was good, a lot of good fortune from my perspective. I had been doing that work in Indianapolis, and was able to work with some of the leaders in the field to help to refine what they were doing into something that we could bring to market, which was the Indiana Health Information Exchange. And that sort of started to get a lot of attention right around the time when folks in Massachusetts were starting to conceptualize the idea of making some kind of investment in a large experiment in health IT. And in particular, is Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, who had sort of a step forward and said that they wanted to make a large investment to sort of demonstrate what are the benefits of electronic health records, because the industry, I know it's really hard for people to sort of project themselves back to a time when it was a barren landscape of electronic medical records, and we also had no idea how it was actually going to happen, because the difficult economics of healthcare presented a real economic stalemate. It was kind of a classic public goods problem in sort of the economics definition, where no individual actor saw it as being in their rational self-interest to make the investment because they couldn't keep the benefits to themselves. And so as a result, no one would invest. It was like like a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation. So the payers felt like, well, I can't stop my competitors from benefiting from this, so I'm not going to do it. And the doctors were like, well, everyone else is getting the benefit. Why am I being asked to pay the costs? So you had this real stalemate. Blue Cross being 50 to 60% of the commercial market in Massachusetts, and being a nonprofit, being Massachusetts based, having a lot of vision, I think themselves, stepped forward and said, you know what, why don't we in Massachusetts just put a big chunk of money on the table here, run some pilot projects, and that might help accelerate everyone's thinking, about how to move forward here. And again, I was just a really fortunate person at the time to have been doing this signature work out in Indianapolis, and this started happening in my backyard. I also had my third child by then and was really hating the travel. BCG was great. One thing I hated about BCG was, out on Monday, back on Friday for, like almost 6 years. So this is the opportunity to leave BCG, but do something that seemed like it was just a great opportunity in an industry that was about to take off. And so I was asked to be the CEO of the Mass eHealth Collaborative, which was really fortunate.
So, as you were there, so it was before, the Obama election, and before Affordable Care Act and the, the HITECH Act before
before 5 years before.
Yeah. So, but you were there, and then you stuck with it though after that came in as well. So what was sort of like the before and the after times like as far as getting the collaborative going and, making, like EHRs more mainstream?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the before was, total Wild West. We were making stuff up. And I mean that in a good way.
Yeah.
We were, we had a vision. We had great, great leadership from the board, Blue Cross and the Mass Medical Society, the Massachusetts Hospital Association, others, great physician leadership. And some of the luminaries in the field also, like Dr. Alan Gorel, Dr. John Hamka, John Glasser, right? They were all sort of the brain
Yeah.
trust. So I had a great degree of confidence that, okay, I can rely on these people to help inform me and help guide me here. But once it came to what we were going to do, we said we're going to select 3 markets in Massachusetts, and what we said at the time was we're going to wire you for healthcare. And of course, this is the BCG hubris, right, coming into play. That was like, don't really know what that means, but let's move ahead and keep with the vision, and we will keep figuring it out along the way, and we'll do good stuff because we're going to listen to the customers and we're going to listen to people along the way. And so that's what we said, and then that ended up being a program where we said we will pay for electronic health records and we will connect them up via interoperability mechanisms, and then we'll create a data warehouse on top of all of that to aggregate data out of those EHR systems and do analysis of, what are the benefits to patients? What are the benefits to providers? What are the, sort of improvements in quality, hopefully, and what's the impact on cost of all of these systems? But at the time, right, there was no ONC certification. There were, standards were basically through standards development organizations. EHR vendors basically did what they wanted. So that was a big part of, the program was working with EHR vendors, getting some really knowledgeable people to help us develop a technical specification that was based on HL7 standards and all of that, and also developing what in a way was our version of meaningful use, because we had the same problem in a way that CMS had later, which was we're giving a whole bunch of money to people, telling them to purchase technology with it. But then we wanted to say, well, but you have to use the technology in certain ways. We can't just have you, purchase it and play video games on it. So that was where we came up with, and here are the things that we expect you to do: e-prescribing, electronic lab results, decision support, basic documentation of key data elements, things like that.
It was interesting. You think back on it that Massachusetts, while you're sort of making it up because it needed to be made up, there wasn't anything else that was there, and it sort of set the groundwork for being able to do some of these bigger scale standards and programs later on. And at the same time, the so-called Romney Care was going on, which also became a blueprint for Obamacare. So a lot was occurring in Massachusetts at that moment.
Yeah, and it's interesting that this. In hindsight, we might have wanted to give a little bit more thought to saying, how do you, sort of take what's going on in healthcare and merge it, connect it with the technology side, right? Because, right, as you being a BCG, person, David, you never implement technology without a strategy, right? Figure out your strategy first and then implement the technology. In this case, we were kind of doing it in parallel, partly because of timing,
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened later when we talk about HITECH. It's a little bit of what happened there, but also because there was a sense back at the time that, well, we want to isolate as few variables as possible. So let's just drop health IT into the current economic model and see what health IT does. Which again is, you look back on it and you think, well, that's a little bit of a fanciful academic sort of approach, but it would have been too hard to figure everything else out.
I think it was okay because you were talking about the sort of prisoner's dilemma. Like there was something there to resolve. Like there was, there were a few sort of hobbyist docs that we knew that had, taken on electronic medical records, and there was value. And as a patient, we walking into the doctor's office at the same time that you'd go to a bank, and things were starting to be more electronic, and you'd have what we would call today interoperability, even at the time of ATMs. You go to the doctor's office, it's filled with all these paper files, and they couldn't find anything, and people knew there was something wrong. And so you sort of solved that dilemma when you had the opportunity with Blue Cross being able to step up, and then the other things can happen in parallel too. So I don't think you should be so so hard on yourself. But and
Okay,
also
good.
strategy is always clear in retrospect. So that's another thing that you can
That's true.
that you can learn.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Now the
yeah.
thing is that you started it well before ARRA, HITECH, the Affordable Care Act, but you continued on afterwards. So once it was done, what were you doing within Massachusetts and then beyond the borders of Massachusetts as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, originally the thought was that, well, Blue Cross is going to put this money on the table. We're going to run these pilot projects, and this would be an organization that would run the pilot projects, and that's what we would do. And I didn't have, any sort of sense, or no one had, there was no expectation, let's just say, either with me or with the board, that we would try to make that a sustainable business after that. Which in some ways was a good thing, right? I was just leaving BCG. I was like, fine,
Yeah,
give me 5 years. You're telling me I don't have to worry about revenues because Blue Cross is going to give
yeah,
us $50 million and just run the project, right? And so that's great. It's all about execution. But then, what a couple things happened. One is, we got the pilot projects up and running. We were able to show a lot of lessons learned. And then the, high tech, sort of started, sort of looming on the horizon as, the Bush administration ended, the economy collapsed. President Obama came in, ARRA, and then HITECH. And one of the things that we discovered, just as we were thinking about sunsetting the organization, was that because I didn't want to be the CEO who saw their job as just keeping the nonprofit going for the sake of
yeah.
keeping the nonprofit going. Right? I kind of felt very strongly. If we're delivering value, great. If we're not a problem, right? Mission accomplished. Let's pack our bags and move to the next thing. But then as HITECH started coming, we were starting to think about sunsetting the organization, but then we started to get queries from the private sector on people were saying, oh, wait a minute, you've got this team of people who have implemented electronic health records in the community, ambulatory docs, for, over 600, 700 physicians, and you've built interoperability and you've built a data warehouse on top of that, extracting data out of those EHR systems. Before you disband them, can we hire them?
Yeah.
Like, is there some way for us to just contract with you? Like Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, for example, they were looking at the time, investing in an electronic health record for all their ambulatory docs. And they didn't have the staff. They were looking at it and saying, our hospital IT staff doesn't know a whole lot about, how to do that out in the ambulatory setting. And so that was one of our first, inquiries from the market of saying, hey, can we just hire you on a consulting basis? And that's when we went back to the board and said, it looks like there's some market appetite here for the capabilities that we have. And, and maybe it makes sense for us to, to have a go at it, all under a nonprofit umbrella, to allow us to, continue investing back in the services and not have an expectation that we have shareholders or anything. It's just to say, we're going to keep doing this to help support providers and help support, community health at large. So anyway, that's when we did our pivot, to be, basically a consulting service to healthcare stakeholders, not just in Massachusetts, but we built that as a sort of a nationwide business and a data analytics business. So we did the consulting side, which was helping people implement electronic health records. And then we built a data analyst business on top of that, which was extracting clinical data out of those systems and helping people with their clinical quality measures for what at the time was called pay for performance. Now it's called accountable care, value-based purchasing, but same thing. Calculating clinical quality measures, collecting data, curating it, normalizing it, and then calculating the measures for them so that they could do their reporting to commercial and public payers.
So I remember when I think when ONC was established and these funds were available to set up these regional extension centers, and I went to Washington 2 or 3 times to be chair and participant in these committees that were recommending who was actually going to get the money to have these regional extension centers. And it was interesting because you talked about how you were inventing things, you didn't know where things were coming from. Now this was just a few years later, and now groups in the rest of the country, some of whom had made some efforts before, but a lot of them were really just forming in response to this federal funding opportunity. And it was interesting to read all the applications because they were pretty different from one another. And in some cases, there was political pressure toward, one to one group versus another. And I felt like I was doing my, public service at the time by being able to help to guide it to the right spot and to, and to be helpful to get the right recs organized. And I think we had statewide health information exchange grants as well. If you look back now in your role in ONC, were those recs and that whole, ARRA HITECH program, Were they successful in achieving their, their goal? And I think the money was, instead of 50 million, it was 50 billion or so. But was there, how has that done if you look back now a decade later?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we helped inform some of that. So there's a little bit of bias there
Of
that
course.
I'll disclose. So
Just note
we
that exactly.
yeah. I mean, we had our Mass Health Collaborative pilot projects. And then right after that, then Mayor Bloomberg in New York City had made available $20 million to the New York City Department of Health for them to invest in electronic health records. And that team that was led at the time by Dr. Farzad Mostashari, who of course went on to become the national coordinator before me. He came to visit, and we shared all of our lessons learned, and a lot of what they did was leveraging and improving upon the things that we did. And then we wrote a paper that was in Health Affairs called "A Tale of Two Communities" or something,
Yeah.
or "A Tale of Two Projects" or something, where we tried to drive lessons learned about the need for elbow to elbow support, particularly for primary care physicians in implementation. And we sort of showed what were the costs that no kidding costs that we actually saw as we implemented this stuff. So that helped inform the REC program, I think, in particular, in the Meaningful Use program. But back to your question, it was like $40 billion, I think, for the incentives, roughly. And then there was probably like another $700 to $800 million for HIE, and probably an equal amount that went to REC programs. Looking back on them, I think that they were, I think they were very successful, but in different ways. So the REC program, I think, was enormously successful in terms of, just the operational, sort of implementation support that they provided. And, sure, it varied by state, but if you think about who these RECs were helping, it was federally qualified health centers as well as other health centers, and primary care physicians, small primary care physicians, and being able to provide them the sort of the on-site support for the implementation of electronic health records, where they didn't have health IT staffs. I mean, they still don't, right? But even back then, I mean, they didn't have anything. And there was a real asymmetry in terms of their level of sophistication versus the vendor, who was coming in and doing a whole bunch of stuff, and they needed a lot of support to be able to help to manage the vendor, as well as to adapt, adjust their workflows, have reasonable expectations about what's it going to take on their side, what's their revenue loss going to be as they go through training, how are they going to have a good cutover of revenue cycle, because one of the things that we learned early on in the pilot projects was, if you don't have a seamless cutover of revenue cycle, everything else stops, right? If people stop getting paid, they don't care about your EHR anymore. They're not getting paid anymore. So all of those things, I think, were really important, and I think they were really successful, at the end of the day. The HIE program, I think, I would argue, was very successful, but in different ways. Because certainly if you looked at it and said, well, how many of those state-level HIEs survived? And I would, certainly acknowledge that very few of them, actually, and the ones that are still around today and they're the most successful, like the Indiana Health and Information Exchange, were there before, right? They were actually already successful before.
Yeah.
They, did a lot of great stuff with the dollars that they received, but they're the ones who are surviving later. So very few of them actually ended up surviving. But where I think it was, really, really beneficial, and to me, this is a core federal government function, is what I would argue that it was basic research. That there's a ton of heterogeneity in the U.S. From a regulatory perspective, from a technology perspective, from a sort of a cultural and industry makeup perspective. If you look state to state, right, each market looks different. The Boston healthcare market is very different than the Phoenix healthcare market, and the regulatory paradigms and the state laws and all of those things that are important to HIE. One of the things I like to point out is that implementing an electronic health record in Boston and in Nome, Alaska, and in Arizona is pretty much the same. There's actually not that much of a difference, right? I mean, you put the people in, and once they get there, they don't even know where they are. But HIE is really different in those three places. And so we needed to have a model to sort of, root out what are those differences, and particularly, the complexities around consent, and the complexities around trust, and the complexities around, real operational capability and what it actually takes to be able to do that stuff. I think that in that sense, I think it was just tremendously beneficial, because it gave us a ton of on-the-ground experience implementing this stuff. And it taught us a lot of hard lessons about, what are the things that are just going to be too hard to tackle in a very fragmented economy like ours, and where are going to be the opportunity areas for us to think about how HIE, should develop going forward. And clearly it shot down the model of every state having their own
Yeah.
HIE and connecting all those up. And I was very much a part of that, right? I'm
Right.
not criticizing anyone for having that vision. And if it did nothing else, it was really good that it accelerated our sort of recognition that, all right, that's not the right model. We could have wasted 15 years doing that.
Yeah.
Instead, in a short 2 to 3 years, we were able to say, all right, that's not going to work. let's move on to other models.
So, moving ahead a little bit here, you talked about before your, being self-effacing about, why you went for your PhD instead of something else. But when it came time for President Biden to, select a new head of ONC, you were kind of the obvious consensus choice by that time. So all these things that you had done, I'll just say that you don't have to try to dispute me on that one. But that's all I heard. Okay, Mickey's the right guy to get in there. So that was great. So were you excited for the job? Any hesitation about it? Or it was just sort of, okay, yeah, it's logical. Now you're going to do it. And you sort of step in and it was what you expected after, being in this business for about almost 20 years by this point. Is it sort of just going, to the logical next thing, and you kind of knew what to expect when you got there? You'd worked in government before. You're all ready to go?
Yeah. So, unambiguously excited. So definitely very, very excited, both because of the role and because of, my strong support for the Biden administration and everything the Biden administration's about. And so, had very strong affinity there. The role and the unique role that ONC plays was really exciting. And I'd been, close to the agency, so I'd seen, what ONC does, and had tried to support, everything that ONC was doing from the outside through federal policy committees and all of those things. And I knew the senior leadership, who I've known for a number of years as well. So that was also a really good thing. The Deputy National Coordinator, Steve Posnack, and Elise Anthony and Lisa Lewis. These are all folks that I've known for a number of years. So that was also really helpful as well, to see there was a stability of such, such high talent in the management ranks there. Made it really exciting to be able to work more directly with the team. The other thing that I would say is, sort of as you think about the trajectory of health IT, I was really excited about, coming in now, because I have a slide that I use that, that sort of applies the Gartner hype curve to, to electronic health records and health IT. And I feel like, the trough of disillusionment was, so the peak of expectations was like meaningful use stage 1, stage 2, yeah. Right? We're all excited. And then by meaningful use stage 3, everyone's like, oh my God, this is really hard work. And this is, awful. And then we get to the trough of disillusionment where the 21st Century Cures Act comes in and the Congress steps in and says, hey, everyone, you need to be doing more here. And we're going to push you to do the things that, we were hoping you would do on your own. And now we have the opportunity to say the slope of enlightenment is here, actually. Yeah. And I have the great, honor of being able to build on all the great work that all my predecessors did to get this foundation in place, to say we can now start to think about what is it we really want to do to improve people's lives. So really, really exciting time for me.
What are some of the key initiatives that you're working on at ONC now?
Well, the inbox is never empty is one of the, the federal government things that you kind of learn. And I remember that from my previous job, but it's even, more the case now and in the Department of Health and Human Services and being the head of an agency. But the key things that I would, just sort of point to are, one is standards. So moving forward with, creating that foundation of data standards, with this, the U.S. core data for interoperability is kind of the minimum data set for the the healthcare industry, and sort of firmly establishing that across the industry, so that we can start to make the pivot from being a system that's kind of based on paper, bricks and mortar, but just has an electronic overlay, to one that actually starts to act like, no, we're digitally native. This stuff is actually bits and bytes. And so we ought to be thinking about how would we do this stuff, as if we knew from the beginning that we're just going to do it based on bits and bytes. So the US CDI is a part of that. The FHIR APIs, which for those who don't know what those are, it's basically say, how do we use modern internet conventions that you use on your smartphone every single day to be able to interact with the services that you want to interact with, to be able to get the data that you want to be able to get in every other walk of life. Why aren't we doing that in healthcare as well, so that we can start to have the capabilities that other industries have? Like you think about, we talk a lot about interoperability in healthcare. I think that we need to move more to interactivity. So interoperability is, kind of, I send you information, you send me information, I send you information. Interactivity is where systems are built with the expectation that they are going to interact dynamically and in real time. The examples I like to give are, think about Kayak and Expedia, right? They aren't doing just interoperability. They're not sending data to you overnight so that you have, every airline schedule in your big honking database, and, and you upload it in batch mode every single night. They are dynamically firing off APIs in the background when you say you want to go to San Francisco, and oops, I want to go tomorrow afternoon, not tomorrow morning. That's how we want healthcare to work. Why can't we have public health systems that are actually more interactive in nature to say, oh, that looks like viral hepatitis. Let me ask for 3 more pieces of data to be able to get that, and then be able to dynamically send the message back to the provider saying, that's viral hepatitis.
Yeah.
You need to do something about that, right? Our systems aren't built like that today, and that's what we want to be able to get to. So that interactivity piece, which is based on data standards, and it's based on these standard interface types of approaches, like FHIR APIs is one piece of that. The second piece is networks. TEFCA is the name of it, Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. No one needs to worry about what that actually stands for. It's basically nationwide networks. So imagine a world where Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile couldn't connect with each other, or they imperfectly connected with each other. That's a little bit of where we are today with nationwide interoperability. These networks that exist. And they are connected. So I'm not pretending, don't want to say that they're not, because they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for the work that, has been done in the private sector to get those to the level that they are. And just for reference for people, the Care Equality Network does roughly 50 million transactions per day of, healthcare transactions. And just as a benchmark, the SWIFT Global Banking Network does 41 million per day. So, people are always saying, oh, how come healthcare can't be like, financial services? Well, at least on one measure, there is a lot of interoperability happening. But the private sector has gone, I would argue, about as far as it can go on its own, because now we have some other kinds of things we want to do with network interoperability that are in the public interest, but are too hard for the private sector to tackle, like payers participation in these networks, for example. Right now, payers aren't really allowed to participate as side-by-side members of those, because of the competitive issues related for providers and payers. Public health agencies aren't allowed to participate in these networks, which is somewhat shocking when you think about it in hindsight of what we've just been through. So those are a number of things that TEFCA, which is the authority that ONC has to create a nationwide governance model for nationwide interoperability. Those are the things that we're going to be tackling, and those we announced beginning of this year that it's ready for people to participate, and the applications are open. We have 9 networks so far that have submitted letters of intent about their intent to join. A number of them are familiar to people, like Epic, the EHR vendor, has announced that they intend to be a QHIN or apply to be a QHIN qualified network. As well as others, Commonwealth, NextGen, the EHR vendor that serves a lot of federally qualified health centers. So we're getting a lot of really good sort of market interest in that. So that's really important, and we expect that in 2023 is when the network will go live, as those networks get approved and move to implementation. So we've got the interoperability piece on the top with the data and the interfaces. We've got the network interoperability, and then the last thing I would point to is a real focus on appropriate use of data, and that has a number of different dimensions. So, as you start to think about algorithms and the increasing ways that algorithms are used, how do we think about that in the context of use? And then health equity in general. How do we think about the appropriate use of data as it relates to being able to recognize where we have equity issues and being able to develop capabilities to be able to rectify those, hopefully, or at least not perpetuate them in the healthcare delivery system.
So, Micky, I think it's hard to talk about health IT or any IT in 2022 without bringing up the issue of cybersecurity. As we're recording this, there's a major system that's affected by bad actors that are out there. Is cybersecurity at all sort of within your remit, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, it's not directly in ONC's remit, except to the extent that all of our everything that we do with certification, there are certain certification requirements that certified EHR vendors are required to support, like encryption, like, role-based access, like, multi-factor authentication, things like that are required in the EHR system. But I think one of the things that everyone, hopefully should recognize is that cybersecurity in an enterprise is, about people, process, and technology. Right. So it's, about all of those things coming together. So, and an electronic health record, which is where we have authority, is just, and if you go into a complex hospital system, for example, the EHR is just one piece of it, and it lives within a broader ecosystem. So, certainly everything that we do is to say, from the EHR perspective, we want to make sure that is up to snuff with respect to, sort of all of the best practices in industry from a technology perspective. And then, we obviously everything that we do with interoperability and all of that is building on the HIPAA privacy rule and the HIPAA security rule, which, is a part of, sort of the overall context that we think is really important for people to follow. But, cybersecurity is a big issue. The department's looking at it. The entire administration is looking really hard at that for the healthcare sector as well as for other sectors.
So, Micky, to finish up on a more personal note, I wonder if there are any books that you've had a chance to read lately, anything that you recommend from, current reading or past?
Yeah. So what am I reading right now? I was trying to think of her first name, but I'm reading right now Geraldine Brooks. She wrote the book Caleb Crossing, which is a really fascinating book about Nantucket and the Wampanoag tribe in living in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard before, this is pre-independence in the U.S. So in the colonies and like the founding of Harvard, and an individual named Caleb, who I think was based on a real person, who was Native American of the Wampanoag tribe, who ended up going to Harvard. And, totally fascinating story. Now I'm reading another book that she wrote called March, which is about the Civil War. And, again, based on, I think, a set of true stories related to family in Massachusetts whose father served in the Civil War. And sort of the experience of coming back, making his way back to his family.
Oh, that sound like a couple of good ones. I'll have to pick it up. Well, I want to say thank you today for my guest, Micky Tripathi, National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at US HHS. I really appreciate you joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast.
Great. Thanks so much, David. Really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.